Good day everybody! Today I'm doing a tutorial about the strength of procedural node-based materials. Recently I gave a talk at UsByNight and a lot of you people wrote me if it was available online, but unfortunately it isn't. So I decided to do this tutorial based on the talk. And the good thing is that in the tutorial I don't have a time limit. So let's see how long this will take. So first off, let me show you what I want to do. I've made this model of a shiny sphere, so to speak. I heard in Cinema 4D spheres are very common and very liked, so I did one. Also, if you look closely, it resembles kind of my material ball. And if you look even closer, you can see even a Pixar character in that. But yeah, don't mind. So let's see where we are going with that. Obviously, that is a very complex object with lots of materials. So I don't go over every detail of it, but I'll show you how you can do a nice material using this model. So you have to use an SDS model in order to get your vertex maps looking correctly and to get to this level of detail where you have scratches and all sorts of tiny irregularities that make the material look more realistic. As I've said, we are not going to make all of the materials, but we are going to make one of the materials. And the great power of that is, since it's procedural, you can very quickly change it and add color and add other effects to it, and then therefore being able to populate the object with materials very fast. So let's get back to our sphere here. And by the way, if you're not familiar with the layout of Cinema 4D, I shuffled it around a little bit, so it's not too bad here. We have the object manager here, and those are the attributes right now setting to Octane settings. So let's go back to attributes here. So let's go to one object here, which we will be concentrating on during our tutorial. And this is that one here. So let's jump out of our camera and make this solo, and that works quite nicely as I see. So let's see what's wrong here. Let's go to find the object. Okay, I guess the solo didn't work because it was the SDS object selected, not the actual geometry. Right, so all of that, what I'm doing with the procedural materials is based on Vertex Maps. So what you want to do is create Vertex Maps in the first place. So what I did here is using the font break selection, and the shortcut is UN. So if you're living in Europe, it's very easy to memorize that. So the UN is a thing here. Now you can really easily select edges that you like. And I'd recommend you to separate your selection. Of course, you can do select all, but I recommend you to restrain your selection to convex and concave edges. Now, let's keep it at select all, and you can go to select and then to select Vertex Weight and then set it to 100%. And this essentially gives you a vertex weight that you then can use in your materials. Now what I have done here is, and let's do this, and obviously we need to re-solo our object because it's now a different object. If you go to a vertex map that is labeled concave, you can see that all the concave edges and areas are selected. And if you go to the convex vertex map, you can see all the convex edges are selected. So this is what we will use for our object then. So alright, let's go outside of the object then and start creating. So let's unsolo everything so we have a better context, and let's create a material. Now with that sort of object, I want to have a material where I have the freedom to layer. I know that Octane 2019, which I'm using right now, has a material layering system, but I'm not using that right now because I haven't looked into that very deeply. So what I want to do instead is using the blend material that is somehow now called Octane Composite. Okay, so let's jump into the Octane Composite, and I've created a Octane node view tab here, so it's easier to get the space I need, because those node trees are getting more and more complex the more I'll do to them, obviously. So let's start rendering here. And we obviously want to assign our material and then get started. So I want to make 3 distinct materials. And let's first of all get this show all to get the alignment correctly. So let's create 3 materials. Material 1, material 2, material 3. If you would need more materials than 3, you can up the number and then therefore get more slots here. Now let's spread those materials out quite nicely so we have enough space to play around. So as you know me, I want to be very tidy, because when I reopen scenes in the future, I really want to know what I did there. And as all humans, I forget stuff. And if that's a very messy node tree, I can't remember what I did and have to take my time to work and see how things were done. All right, so let's think of that as layers. So first of all, this object should be made of metal. So the first layer should be an octane metallic material. And I always set the BSDF model to GGX because it has a more physical response and acts to roughness more physically accurate than the legacy octane option. Alright, so let's do the same here. Let's show all to get the material aligned nicely. Then the next is a paint layer. So I want to go to Octane, Octane Glossy, also make this a GGX material here. And also make show all to get the material preview going nicely. Last but not least, it's the dirt layer. So sometime when we let our objects rotting around, then there's some gathering of dirt on top of those. I know that everything should have a reflection, but I'm going with a diffuse material right here. So let's set this to show all, and that's basically it. What we could do right now is to name our materials so we have less trouble to getting our scene red when we reopen it. So that's the metal, that's the paint, and that's the dust. All right, so let's see if everything's working correctly by rendering our scene here. So let's see if this object is actually behaving like we want. So I noticed that sometimes you have to go back to the view in order to make Octane update. That's somehow a restriction right now. Okay, so now we can see that our material has loaded correctly and that we can move on from there. So first of all, I want to bring in our vertex map. So let's scroll down here and get the vertex map in here. And since we don't need any preview, let's disable that. And if you go to shader, you can just drag in your vertex map, and that's the concave one. And the concave one is down here where we want to get our dust from. Then duplicate that, and note when you duplicate vertex maps, the input will be gone. So if you duplicate them, you have to populate the input again. Alright, so let's get to our convex map here and drag it in. And then we can assign it to our material. Let's drag this in here. And we can see that there's something happening, but it's not really what we want. And the reason is that we need to invert the mask here in order to get the right result. So let's drag and invert in between this and try again. So now we're getting what we want, and we're getting used metal edges. Now, of course, this is not looking as we want it right now because we need to set up our materials first. So let's go to the metal, go to specular and make it 0.8 or something, because no material ever reflects 100% of the light. There's always some energy loss. Same for our diffuse material. We want this to be rather dark, so let's go to 0.05 or something like that. Also, this gets us to see the metal edges better. And then add some roughness to both. So let's add 0.2 here and maybe 0.4 here. Okay, right now, so we have already established a nice edge to our material. Let's go down here and give this material a nice dirt color. So we are going with maybe 25, 15 and 50 or something like that. You can't see anything here because we have not applied the mask right now. So if I do that, you can see we're getting some nice dirt on the edges here. So on the concave areas. Right, so this is a very basic thing in the material. Now we could leave it at that, but it's not very advanced, is it? So what we want to do is get some variation in here. And I will do that by bringing in a texture. And I know that textures are not directly speaking procedural, but I use textures because they can have some more variation than noises, and with noises you would need a lot of tweaking to get it looking right. So I have my favorite texture here, so let's go up here and go to image texture. Since I know that this image texture will be black and white, I can already set it to float to save some memory, otherwise it will be loaded at RGB and therefore take up 2/3 more space in the video memory. So let's load our texture here, and if you know me, I use that texture quite a lot, and notice that the size isn't really big. It's 2K, but it's totally efficient enough for big renders if you know how to use it. So I have UV'd all of my objects. So if I drag this into the diffuse channel, you can see it displays quite nicely. But if you don't have UVs on your objects, you could always use a triplanar mapping. And to do that, there's some steps required here. I already have done a tutorial about that. You need a projection that you then set to triplanar. This will temporarily disable your object's material right now because it doesn't know how to deal with that until we are using a triplanar node on the other side. So let's put that here to decipher what the projection wants it to do. Now, right now, it's still not working correctly, and this is because it wants to see us populate all those ports here. But we can always use a single texture, and that will just use the X input and populate everything else with it. And what I always do is to just expose the X input and therefore have a really nice and tidy node tree. Here we go. So you notice that while I was doing this, the resolution here changed. So that's very pixelated right now. So if I zoom in here, you can see that's not the resolution and the sharpness detail I would expect from a good, nicely textured object. So we need to bring in a transform and transform the triplanar projection down to the size we want. So let's see if 0.1 looks good. And what you want to look out for here is repetition. So if you scale it too small, you get repetition in here, and that's obviously not good because it looks unrealistic. So let's get it a little bit bigger. Maybe 0.2 is okay. So there's still repetition, but it's far spread out, so we don't really recognize it. Okay, so that's what we want to do here. Last but not least, we want to bring in the angle a little bit bigger. So this angle here, that is the angle when we have our projection blending between two projection planes of the triplanar mapping. You can refer to my tutorial if you don't know what that value here is. Alright, cool. So we have done that. Obviously, we don't want to use it in the diffuse slot right now or as is. We want to create our mask with that. So to do that, let's pull our vertex map back, create a multiply, and always disable not the node, but the preview. Sorry about that. Enable node. And you can see that I have some display issues here. I don't know where they come from. Maybe it's the NVIDIA driver, maybe it's the new version of Octane. Hopefully you can bear with me here. All right, so let's plug that in here. And let's plug that in there. And let's see what we're doing here by soloing the node. So we have our vertex map that creates our black and white mask. And by multiplying some material, some texture over it, you can see that we are creating some variation. Now we want to control that variation further. And the best way to do that is to create a gradient. So the gradient is a node that I use very often. I use it to remap black and white values. So when I put that in between of our node trees here, nothing changes because now black is still black and white is still white. What I want to do here is to go to our vertex map, and let's just select this and make the edge a little bit smaller. So in order to do that, I have to bring in the black to the white direction. So if I do that, you can see that the gradient now moved inwards. And that's really nice. I don't want to make them too small, but maybe half them in the size. So let's go with 50%. That's looking about right. So if I go back to our multiply, you can see that now we get some variation with a smaller edge. Now I want to even increase the variation, and I can do that by increasing the contrast here. And to do that, I solo that node, and you can see I can just, by pulling those white and black parts together, increase the contrast of the whole texture. As I'm a friend of nice numbers, I'll just type them in here, and let's see what we did. So this is our mask for our metalness or metal rough edges here. So if we go and disable the solo, there's another bug here. We need to reload the whole material. You can see, let's get the diffuse out. You can see that now we are created some variation here that's looking rather nice and more realistic than the uniform way the material looked before. So next, let's tidy up our node tree a little bit. So in order to get this a bit more readable, here we go. Select hierarchy, put that in here, select hierarchy here. I guess you have to select everything beforehand. Here we go. So it's a bit more tidy now. And next, you might have noticed that the surface area here looks very uniform. Through the years of my experience, I always notice that there's this irregularities that makes things realistic. So let's produce irregularities on that surface here. Alright, so I'll go. Who wonders about that is go to grab a gradient, and I want to set it from simple to complex. And what's that doing is it's giving us some more ports to work with. So let's grab and show all. So if you look at the tree here, and let's see, that's really annoying right now. So let's reset to default. So you can see that the start node and the end node have their own values. If I bring in another node, you get a value 3. And if you take it out, you get only 2. So you can think about that as following. So that's the start value, then there's value 1, then there's value 2, and then there's the end value. The start and the end value are not present in Cinema 4D, but are in the Octane gradient. So if you set your system up, you want to use the start and the value 1 as 1 and the end as end value 2 or whatever comes least. So let's just get the triplanar texture from our nice variation map here, and then get the float to act as the start and value 1 and as the end and value 2. Right, so let's align that right now because I'm a very tidy person. Here we go, something like that. So we want to drive our roughness with that. So let's see what our roughness does. It's at 0.4 right now. So my workflow for that has always been the same. I'm okay with the roughness. I just want to put in some variation. So what I do is I go here and put that to 0.35 and that to 0.45. So I have a variation of 1 around the value of 4. And if I put that into the roughness, you can see that there's some slight variation here. Now, if the variation isn't enough, you can increase the separation. So 3 to 5. It's still, to 5. It still revolves around the value of 0.4, which we defined before, but the variation is now bigger. So let's leave it at that for now and just do the same maybe for the diffuse. So let's go to the diffuse and check that. It's 0.05. And let's just copy that. And there's another bug. I need to get active material again to make it show up all the ports. So if we plug this in, of course, that's not working because we have still not connected our texture and the wrong values in here. So let's go to 0.06 or something to 0.045 or something. Yeah, that's looking better. So now we are also getting some variation in the color. So right now you might say, okay, this gradient is doing the same as this one. And this is right, except for the values that go in. But you can always fiddle around with your gradient here and get some slightly different results. You could also do an inverse. So let's go to 4.5 and to 6 here. So you get the inverted result there. And you can do a lot of stuff like that in order to get your one map looking differently on the object. So now we have an inverted map, and maybe the brighter part here, so the 0.6 part is a bit too bright, so we go back to 0.55. But this is just stuff you would need to fine-tune as you go along with your materials. So obviously if you are doing a commercial product, you want to be very minimalistic with that. There's still variation in that, and variation is always good to create realism. So never go without doing some variation on your objects, but keep it to a minimal level. And the good thing is that this technique with a gradient allows you to be very minimalistic because you can go very small increments here and therefore just grade what you want. Okay, now moving on. As you go closer with the camera to the object, you might notice that there is just a blend between materials, but in real world, obviously the metal layer is underneath the paint layer, so we need to have something there that looks as if the paint was chipped away. So to do that, it's also very simple, since we have already have a mask in place. And by mask, I'm speaking about this thing here. So what we could do is use that to drive our bump. So the bump is working in a way that black is always the bottom layer, and the lighter the material gets, the higher the bump will be shown. So we need the exact opposite, and we already have that. If I solo this node here, you can see that this is what we want. So let's select the hierarchy here. Select hierarchy, move that back because we want to add some effects here. And then we use another multiply. Since the Octane material has no bump strength slider, we need to use a multiply. So there are multiple methods to do that as always, but I use the bump multiply method to get my strength in here. So I'll get a float slider, and the float is essentially my strength of the bump. So when I get this in here and then disable solo reload, here we go. Obviously, in Octane, you always have to use very small values. So 0.01 or even 0.005 or something would be good. So now you can see that the bump is working, and you get this nice looking chipped away look for the paint to the metal. So since that is the same for the metal and the paint, I recommend to just copy that same effect and put it into the metal as well. So you get a little bit more detailed look there. You can see it here, it looks quite nice. So let's go even 0.05 for the strength's sake. You have to be careful to not overdo it most of the time. All right, cool. So we have that. Let's zoom out a bit. So on the edges, we've got a lot more detail right now. Okay, so great. Now that we've done that, let's go for the next step. I want to create even more detail in those areas. How I'm going to do that? By bringing in another triplanar material. So just copy the whole tree and then go to the material here and exchange that for some scratches. And to demonstrate what those are doing, I will black them in just into the diffuse. So right now the map is rather big, and you can see it's a bit pixelated because it's even smaller. It's 512 by 512. So what I want to do is get the scale down here. Now obviously there's some repetition, but what I want is to refine the edges. But on the edges it's almost impossible to notice any repetition, so I'm fine with that. Now what I want to do here is create a bit of a broader edge where we can see those scratches. So I'm actually repeating my procedure here by multiplying the edge map here with the vertex map. So what I get are the edges where there's a little bit more material paint chipped away every now and then. Okay, that's looking great so far. So the cool thing is that I use that edge instead of our edge that we used for the initial metal, which is smaller, so we have a broader edge there. Obviously, we could use a gradient to fine-tune everything, but right now I'm fine with the result. So how do we bring this edge and this edge together? Oh, sorry, this edge and this edge together. There's the method with the add, because it's a mathematical operation. You can add brightness levels to other brightness levels. You should be careful though to use that in diffuse channel, because with a diffuse channel you always have the risk of running into problems of a too bright diffuse material, and you shouldn't do that if you're familiar with physical based lighting. So let's bring together these things, and it's totally reasonable here because we are using this as a mask and not driving our diffuse right now with it. So let's go back here and then just for now bring that into the diffuse to see what it's doing. Well, we could just solo it, I guess. So now we brought in our broader scratches to our smaller scratches. And we will just feed that into our invert because that's what we need to get our mask here. And then just let it render again. And if that's happening, you didn't go out of solo mode before reloading. You have to go to path tracing again in order to create the look. Great, so now we have some broader strokes and scratches here. And the cool thing is, it updated our bump map also because we are using the end result of our mask to bump everything. Okay, so now I say I didn't want to use a gradient, but let's just use a gradient to get a bit more detailed mask out of that. So let's bring in the whites to maybe 30. So we get this really chipped away look here. And let's get our blacks to 5. So you can see now that that's what I'm after. So we have every now and then we have those big chunks of paint chipped away because it was bumping into something or so. Okay, great. So again, it's time to get our node tree a bit more tidied up. So right now, the next couple of things are just repetitions of what we already did. So I want to bring small things on the whole surface here. So what I'll do, I'll just select hierarchy and move this further back. And then just duplicate that in here because I want to use that as a add to add another layer of things, as I said. So if I move back here, you can notice that there are some scratches not even on the edges, but also on the surface itself. All right, so let's do that. Let's select the hierarchy again, move it down a little, and then just do that. And then duplicate our triplanar map again. So let's go to select hierarchy and duplicate that. So there's another material I want to introduce, another texture I want to introduce. And this is the hairs and deposit. Let's open that real quick and show you. So if I go to my trusty Windows Photo Manager, you can see that's what I want to use here. I'll just load that. And I'll just bring in a gradient in between that, and the gradient should be set to default, at least for the beginning. And then I'll just plug that into the add. So you might not be able to see it because it's rather small, because I copied the material with the scratches where we put a very small scale on it. So if I go to the solo, you can see that this is the mask we're producing. So first of all, I want to increase the scale again to make it a little bit bigger. And second of all, I don't know if you see it in the video, but there's some subtle, slightly dark gray areas here that I want to get rid of. And the best way to do that is to just increase the black values a little bit. So we are only seeing the scratches here. So let's bring up our white values quite a lot. It's like this. And if we disable solo and then reload the material, you will hopefully see some scratches and things on the surface. All right, so, and the really cool thing again is that you have this bump going with it. So if I zoom into some of the things really closely, you can see they're all bumped. Here we go, that one. And this is obviously because we are using the output of all of our operations here to drive the bump. And now we are having some scratches and things. So obviously, if you look at the reference here, you can see there's a lot more going on. There's also those black spots that are quite nice because they're a little bit less rough and stuff like that. I won't go into depth doing those, but I just built a very similar tree that I was using for the mask, just for the roughness of the materials. And therefore you can go very deeply and detailed into the material behavior. What I really find important here is that you'll always be aware of what you're doing. Blindly changing parameters without knowing what's behind it is very dangerous because you're not understanding what you're doing, obviously. So if you're lost, just use the solo node and see what you're doing and what the material is looking like at a certain node tree, and therefore get you a good understanding in where you're going and what you're doing. Now, last but not least, and this is not a very big thing, I want to control our dust a little bit more because the dust is very uniform right now. So to make this change, obviously it's always a repetition of things. So what I want to use is just our triplanar here. And you have guessed it, I use the multiply to multiply the triplanar output of our random texture, so to speak, with our input of the vertex map. And this makes the dust almost disappear. And this is because the triplanar texture here producing a mask that is looking like that. So to make it brighter, you also guessed it, I use a gradient that I'll go to default. Here we go. I'll just disable that. Right, here we go. It's always a good thing to make it tidy. So right now I want a little bit less contrast in there. So what I'll do is go to the black and raise it. So you still have some variation, but it's not as strong as before. You could also bring in the whites a little bit to get the dust effect a little bit stronger. So something like that. Okay, having done that, disabling the solo, reloading the object. You can see the dust is kind of back, but it's not as uniform anymore. And if you want to have the dust a little bit brighter, you always can use the gradient to do that. So let's go to 50%. So you can see that's gotten the dust a little bit more in there. Obviously, you could also use the dust material. Like this is another bug right now that the material is sometimes not loading. And go and have it a bit brighter so it shows up a bit better on the dark materials here. So what have we done here? So it's a node tree that is already a bit complicated, but you still know what you've done. So it's very easy to follow what you've done here. Obviously, with my materials, I have gone a little bit further and added all those scratchy things on the roughness and the material part here. But it's still very easy to follow. So you have those materials where you have chunks assigned to it that make the special parts for those materials. By the way, if you're wondering why I have 4 materials here, there's this logo on the one material that I assigned to that as well. So it's another layer where you have the paint of the logo on top of the other paint. So last but not least, if I use that material and put it on top of the whole thing here, since I renamed all the vertex maps the same. So all the vertex maps on all the objects. Let's just take another object here and see that. So when I go to the object here, cover, and view the vertex map, you have a convex and a concave thing here. And it's called the same, so the naming has to be accurate. But if you do that, you can see that everywhere I put this material on, it behaves like it should. It has some dirty edges here in the screws, for example. It creates dirt and chipped away edges here. Now that I see that, I might reduce the amount of the things a little bit. And since we're using the same material already, it's very easy to do that. Let's just go to the right material in the first place. Let's find the gradient. And let's just set it back to 75 or something to make the things a little bit less pronounced. Yeah, something like that. I really like that. Now the other cool thing is, if we want to, for example, give the cover different material, you just duplicate your material here. And there's also another bug with a preview in the R21. So Maxon, I think it's a problem for Cinema 4D, not an Octane problem. So if you see this, please fix that. It's really important for me to have an accurate material preview in your materials. So I'll just assign that to the cover here. And then I'll go back to my node editor and I can go to the gradient here, where I drive my diffuse of the paint. Now we can use color to make it colorful, but let's just make it a little bit darker. So let's go 0.35 and 0.45. Maybe that wasn't enough, so let's go even darker here. Here we go. That should get a nice distinguishing going. So if I zoom out, you can see that we now created this darker shade here and therefore some variation. And that's basically how I did all of those variations. Obviously there's some anisotropy going on some of the parts. You can see how this was done. So I think that concludes my tutorial with the power of procedural node-based materials. It was the first tutorial I did in a long time, so I was a bit rusty again, and you can see in the video that there's quite some chunks in editing cut out and rearranged. I know also this tutorial is a bit on the long side, and in general I have the feeling that you like tutorials more on the 10 to 15 minute scale. I know that sometimes I appear sort of lazy, and it might be true, but sometimes I'm just working on projects and don't have the time to do new tutorials. So hopefully with this is a new start for some new tutorials that I bring out. So let me know in the comments what you want to see next, what you're interested in. And thank you a lot for staying with me that long if you made it to the end. Yeah, thank you and have a nice day.